My name is Jerry Buckland. I'm the Dean at Menno Simons College. Menno Simons College is the college organizing this event and the connected events, which include a series of presentations on the topic of food security and farm sovereignty, courses that we're offering, and an active website. So welcome here. The title of our series, our public lecture, course, and website series is called How We Grow, Share, and Eat, Moving Towards Just and Sustainable Food and Farming Systems. It's the product of work that was done by the faculty members at Menno Simons in International Development Studies last year, who were trying to figure out what would be a creative way to engage people at a variety of levels on these really central issues of food security and farm sovereignty. And they came up with this interesting model of combining public lectures with our visiting professors, as well as providing courses, and I mentioned the website. So it's an effort to provide different ways to inform, educate, promote awareness about farm sovereignty and food security. So that's a little bit of background. Menno Simons College, I would like to say a few things about it. Oh, before I say that, so the topic for tonight, just so you know you're in the right place, is a presentation by Dr. Nettie Wiebe. And she'll be speaking on the topic of This Land is Our Land, ? Reintegrating Earth, Eating, and Ethics. Before I go to introduction to the topic and to Dr. Wiebe, I'd just like to make a couple of introductory comments about Menno Simons College. I think there are many students here from the college, and so welcome here. Menno Simons College is a Mennonite college, which is a part of Canadian Mennonite University and affiliated with the University of Winnipeg. We're based here at the University of Winnipeg. We offer programs in conflict resolution and international development. If you're not taking courses in those areas, please come and talk to me or one of the Menno Simons College faculty members or staff. We'll tell you more about those programs. So we're hosting this 6-part public lecture series that's funded by our Esau endowment, which was set up by Paul and Esther Esau back in the 1980s. And their goal was to provide funds to allow the college to bring in visiting, distinguished professors from around the world, and indeed that's what we're doing, and that's what we're doing today. And I mentioned we've got the lectures, courses, and the website. Just by way of background, we had 3 presentations in the fall, and I think some of you were able to attend those, and so those went really well. And then we're having 3 presentations this winter term, starting with tonight. And then in February, we have another presentation, and the final presentation is by an MSC faculty member who I will talk about at the end of this presentation. So what's the point of having a series on food security and farm sovereignty? Why is it important? Well, we think it's important because food and farming are fundamental to human society. And yet, in our burgeoning economy that's growing rapidly, and growing rapidly for some, we seem to at times lose an awareness of the importance of this food and farming reality that is so critical. As well, environmental challenges we are facing, and the consequences for farms and for food is very serious. At Menno Simons College, we recognize, in fact, part of our mission is to bring together people with different perspectives and views on critical issues. We recognize that there are a variety of views and perspectives related to food security and farm sovereignty. So for instance, some of those perspectives we could describe as, the globalization versus localization tension, the reliance on high technology versus social change as engines of food security, and economic efficiency versus environmental sustainability. So what we're trying to do in this series is to present 6 presentations that dig into these topics in a deeper way. And as I said, we also have 3 courses running this term that are looking at it more extensively as well. So many of you might know that 2014 was declared the Year of the Family Farm by the United Nations. And they did this because the decision makers at the UN have come to realize that the family farm is foundational for farm sovereignty and food security. They recognize that the family farm offers a multitude of benefits to society at large. However, there's tremendous pressures on the family farm. And we see that in Canada, and those pressures are affecting family farms right around the world. And so, for instance, StatsCan states that the number of farms is steadily decreasing, especially in the prairie provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Well, we know that. That's, you drive out in the countryside and that's visible. But this is happening, this is a phenomenon, and we need to understand what's going on and why it's happening, what are the consequences. So that is sort of the introduction to the topic tonight. Now, the speaker, Dr. Nettie Wiebe, many of you know of. She is a teacher, writer, speaker. She is an organic farmer. She is a farm organization leader and a public policy advocate. I've had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Wiebe over the last few days and learned about her work and her life, and it's really amazing the work that she's done. She has published several books on the topics of food system crisis, food sovereignty, as well as other topics. She is prolific in her research, and she is passionate in her support for farm sovereignty. She's done extensive work with the peasant movement Via Campesina, and lectures a lot in Canada and the US, as well as in developing countries. And finally, her research interests include ethics and ecology, social justice, human rights, and practical personal ethics in the contemporary context. So with that introduction, I'd like you to help me to welcome Dr. Nettie Wiebe.
Thanks for the introduction, although I must say when I saw that little piece, where did you find 300 speeches? I've been talking far too much. That just brings me to my opening plea here. Do excuse my voice. I have caught a cold here, and it could be because it's bloody cold here. I had no idea how sharp that wind could be in Winnipeg, so my voice is not very good. So just excuse it and give me pause periodically to drink something, okay? I'm astonished that so many of you, given what the weather is out there, so many of you are here tonight, and welcome. And I hope that we can have a big conversation. I'm going to say a few things, and then I hope we can have a big conversation about something that matters a great deal to me, and that I hope by the end of the talk you will agree is of fundamental importance to all of us. I chose the title, This Land is Our Land, because you may know that's a line of a very wonderful old Woody Guthrie song that Canadian folk singers revised and made a Canadian version of, and those of us who lived in the 1970s, that's maybe not most of you, but some of us lived in the 1970s, and we loved that music. So This Land is Our Land has a kind of resonance that is both poetic and, I think, bears some thinking about. So I want to talk a little bit about land, focus on land, how it is essential to food, and talk about our relationship to land. How disconnected we are, how distant we are from land, and how dangerous that is. Then I want to say something about I farm, and I want to take you to my neighborhood, my municipality, and talk to you a little bit about, show you a little bit about my lived experience in farming as a small-scale organic farmer in Saskatchewan. And finally, I want us to collectively together explore some alternative ways in which we could view land and talk about land and be in relationship with land. And at some point here, somebody is going to say, stop talking, and then it'll be all over, all right? Those of us who farm have an intimate relationship with land. Actually, everybody who gardens has a pretty intimate relationship with a small plot of land, and you can tell sometimes in summertime who's actually has an intimate relationship to the land because you can see it under their fingernails. So those of us who farm are constantly thinking about and working with land. But that's not the experience of the vast majority of Canadians and of you. And I'm not going to try and persuade you that you should all become small-scale family farmers, although that would be my hope. But I'm not going to persuade you of that this evening. But I hope I will persuade you that a relationship to land, whether you're a farmer or not a farmer, is an important part of us being human beings, of our human responsibility. Because everybody eats. So in one way, your lunch is connected to the land. So insofar as you connect with your lunch, you're connected to the land. But because we're so urbanized, so many of us, in fact, the vast majority of Canadians, and as of quite recently, the majority of actually the global population lives in cities. Most people actually don't live on the land, as the expression goes. Although, of course, you all live on the land, whether you're living somewhere 5 stories up or living on the ground floor. You are all living on the land. We just need to remind ourselves of that. But urbanization has changed people's social relationship to land quite fundamentally. And that's not just because you all love to be in the city, although most urban dwellers are happily urban dwellers. It's also because with industrialization, the jobs are in the city, and fewer of the jobs are out there in the country. Something like less than 2% of the Canadian population actually farms. And we're heading towards what's the case in the United States already, that we will have more prisoners than farmers in this country. That's a depressing thought. Let's move on. But industrialization has not only changed the jobs and moved jobs into urban places and moved jobs off the farm. Industrialization has another effect. And I want to quote here from a writer that many of you are probably familiar with, an American writer, poet, farmer, thinker from Kentucky, Wendell Berry, who says, "One of the primary results and one of the primary needs of industrialism is the separation of people and places and products from their histories." So it's not just physical distance when you move off the land into the city. It's not just the physical distance, it's also social and more historical distance. We're not too far in this western part of the country from being a generation or two from the farm, but we are further and further from that. It used to be that everybody pretty much had at least some relatives still out on the farm, and that's less and less the case. So our family histories are more and more disconnected. But importantly too, he says, industrialization disconnects products from their histories. And I've told some of you in the classroom, and I'll just tell this again. I do a little experiment in one of the classes I teach at St. Andrews. These are graduate students. I do a little experiment. It's a very simple little assignment at the beginning of the class, which just invites students, no, actually assigns students, I am a teacher, assigns students to go and find out something about what they're eating. They can choose their favorite thing, they can choose something small, a big dinner, whatever. Find out where it's grown, how far it's traveled, what the initial product cost or what was paid for it, all the content of it. Just find out something. These are grad students. And when I give this assignment, I often get that kind of, wow, that's a Mickey Mouse assignment. I wonder if she shouldn't stay on the back 40 because she's not really up to this level of teaching. It's going to be really easy. It turns out that it's not easy. In fact, it's almost impossible to complete that assignment unless you choose very consciously something from the farmer's market or from your own garden that you personally had something to do with. Most of what you eat from the grocery stores, you have no idea where it's come from. It is completely disconnected from its place and its history. That has all kinds of implications, but it certainly separates us too far from our food. And insofar as we're separated further and further from our food, we are less and less conscious, less and less aware of the places where that food is grown. And we in the prairie region have, as I said, a history of settlement. Most of you in the room probably had ancestry that settled somewhere in the prairie region. That's certainly my own case. And we, in that instance, also know astonishingly little about the separation of the peoples who were in this place before our ancestors got here. I recommend to you for your reading a book by Candace Savage called Geography of Blood, if you want to know something about what happened to, what that displacement of those peoples from their land and the histories of their land actually meant, what happened there. But now that we're here, once our ancestry came, they made a tremendous effort to be to home here. Those homesteaders, and that's the glorious sort of settler history here, they made a tremendous effort to settle in communities, to build schools, churches, libraries, to own the land. Ironically, and I say ironically because I want to talk a little bit more about ownership of the land, but ironically, they thought that ownership of the land would give them security of tenure in the long run, generation by generation. They built communities to last. They had families. They were here to stay on that land. And for many of that first generation, that was such a wonderful thing to have that kind of security of tenure and to build on that, to have that relationship to the land. For women, it was a bit more of a struggle. The Homestead Act gave us some sort of perch, but it was not till my lifetime, really, that we got Matrimonial Property Act and actually got better ownership rights over the land. Those people came. They came because they were offered this place, but they also came because they wanted place. They wanted relationship to land. They were going to take care of it. They were going to farm. In fact, they were going to farm so brilliantly that they would have excess wheat and we would export wheat. That was one of the sort of promises of this land. That's what they were intending to do. With globalization and further urbanization, equipment in farms has gotten bigger, and with mechanization, of course, you could farm more with fewer people. And with fewer people, you lose farm families from the land, and of course you lose the communities. The community that I'm now farming in actually is, with the exception of one or two houses that are occupied by others, it has nothing but the community hall left. And there are lots of those kinds of communities. So with industrialization, there was a massive displacement. It continues to be a massive displacement of people from the land. And that's ongoing. But still, most of the people out there are family farms. They're bigger farms. Most of us have some off-farm income, but there's still very much communities in many of those places, and they're family farms. And you said I was part of a farm advocacy, farm organization. We've always been members of the National Farmers Union, and the National Farmers Union is a member of an international small-scale peasant and small-scale farmer organization. And when we work in those places, 20 years ago, when we started in that movement, there was a lot of hue and cry from peasants elsewhere in the world about access to land and security of land tenure. But access to land was a huge fight. And we in Canada, and I remember us sort of talking about this, saying, well, you know, agrarian reform and access to land, that really isn't our problem. Because in our context, you buy and you sell land, and some people have to sell, but mostly, I mean, during the 80s, quite a few had to sell, but mostly it's in the marketplace, and it's family farmers getting bigger, but access to land and agrarian reform really isn't us. But things have changed. Things have changed fairly radically. And I want to persuade you now that access to land is us. That is one of our big struggles. The market for land in Canada, and this goes back a couple of years. I was looking through my notes when I was preparing for this, and I pulled out a Globe and Mail article from April of 2008, where the writers in the Globe and Mail say, seeking an agricultural play, by Saskatchewan. Investors can grab a piece of Canada's new IT province with partnerships that purchase farmland and lease it back to farmers. And the investor says, in glowing terms, farming is going to be one of the best places to make money in the next 10 years. If you know what you're doing. That wouldn't be us farmers, that's the investors. Investor and commodity guru Jim Rogers told Reuters in an interview recently. That's 2008. And I clipped it at the time saying, that's odd. I wonder if there's anything to that. Because it didn't seem to us like that was what was going on in our neighborhoods at all. But actually, that is what's going on. Let me just show you. I have to stay by this. In 1994, this is what our municipality looked like. You can't actually read the names, but the wonder of the municipal maps is every quarter section has the owner named on it. And if you look towards the east side there somewhere, you would see a few Wiebe and Robbins quarter sections. That's where we live. That's home. That's been home for the last 30 years. And you'll see the Hatarian Brethren of Willow Park have quite a swatch of land. And otherwise, when I look at that map closely, I see all the neighborhood names. You see lots of Tweedies and Yellowlees and Robins. And that's, if you look at municipal maps, that's how maps looked. And when I said earlier about communities building sort of whole networks of relationships and lots of kinship relationships, those were those communities. That's these kinds of communities. I recently acquired this map a month ago. This is my municipality because something has gone on in my municipality. And you may not be able to see the differences. I mean, one of the differences is that the Hatarian Brethren no longer call themselves Hatarian Brethren. They call themselves the Willow Park Colony. So all the names on their land has changed. Check mark. There are many more women owners named on the land, even from 94 to now. But what's really astonishing about this map is that the ownership pattern has changed radically. If you read the fine print, you will see that two investors this has happened in the last 3 to 4 years, two investors have bought 34% of the municipality. Let me tell you something about these two investors. The first one is Corvan Ray. You'll see his name on lots of the quarters, particularly on this side of the map. I think you have to trust me here because I think you can't actually read those, can you? But it's on the public record, okay? He's in Alberta and a senior Alberta feedlot operator was, and apparently he sold his feedlots and took up what the Globe and Mail had earlier advertised as a great deal for investors. And he has bought in this municipality alone 53.5 quarter sections of arable land. This is only one municipality. He bought more land further south of us, and the municipal secretary said to me when I said, that's a lot of land for one farmer to acquire, she said to me, no, actually, he's got land all over the province. He's spreading his weather risk. So this is only one small pocket of land he's bought. One of the first things he did when his neighbors noticed that something had changed radically, was that he bulldozed down on the quarter sections he bought all of the shelter rows, the shelter belts. You know, we were through the 30s, and in the 30s, the federal government and farmers took it upon themselves to ensure that that land would never again be turned into a dust bowl. We would take better care of it. We would plant shelter rows, and there are thousands and thousands, all of them trees from the Indian Head Tree Farm, that farmers and their children weeded and tended and made sure that they were in space. The first thing that Corvan Ray does is he bulldozes down many, many, many miles of those because they get in the way of his equipment. We're talking big farming here. And you may all know that the Indian Head Tree Farm is also being under threat. The federal government is threatening to close it because our current agriculture minister says we don't need trees anymore either. I just hope they don't appoint him to forestry. The second buyer is another Albertan. I'm not picking on Albertans, this just turns out in my neighborhood, okay? The second buyer is also an Albertan, and the name on the farms is Neil Ray Farms. You don't know who Neil Ray is, but you do know who Nielsen brothers are, of XL beef fame. 2012 E. coli recall, biggest meat recall in Canada. Yeah, okay. Those people. They had to sell the meat, or did sell, I shouldn't say had. They sold the meat plant to JBS, a Brazilian firm, and are buying land. And they're buying pasture land. Nielsen Brothers, or Neil Ray Farms, have bought 56.5 quarter sections in our municipality. And I'm just talking locally here, okay? I mean, you have to extrapolate this to the whole province. I'm just talking in my neighborhood, okay? And let me just show you how that works when they buy pasture land. Firstly, we know they've bought it because they have far more money than any of the rest of us small-time cow-calf operators, so they build good fences, much better fences than we can afford. And they do this. They put locks on their gates. We couldn't believe it. We had never seen this in our country, that you fenced quarter sections of pasture land and then you locked her up good. This is remarkable. We took 2 pictures of it because it was so remarkable. This is just 2 kilometers down from where we are. I just had to show you that because those are my cows. This is strictly a digression, okay? But they are beautiful, all right? So I just want to say, immediately, in my own lived experience, in my neighborhood, what happens when you have outside investors take over huge swatches of land? The first thing that happens is ecological destruction. You bulldoze down the tree rows. And that's symbolic. For me, all of this is symbolic. These are just the outside signs of what actually is going on. So you have ecological destruction, and you have a profound distrust of your community. That's what the locks show. You're not part of that community. As a matter of fact, you are there undermining and destroying that community, because the third thing that happens when you've got land investors big time bringing money in from the outside is that the price of land goes up so high that no young farmer can even begin to think of purchasing. So those are three, in my immediate experience, three very live, real experiences of what happens when the relationship to land is not one of farmer to land, but one of investor to land. Because this land has to be productive, and the agricultural reporters are quite optimistic about all of this. One of our agricultural reporters said in a newspaper recently, this just shows what confidence there is now in the agriculture industry. They're clearly lining themselves up to take advantage of economies of scale. That's why the shelter belts get in the way. And to produce, we think, cheaper beef, cheaper grain per acre. At least that's the possibility. And to have, and this is what the argument will be with the ag economists, to have a more efficient farming sector. But efficiency in this worldview means that it's hierarchical, it's concentrated ownership, it's monocultures, and it's economies of scale. That's what efficiencies are in this context. And when they frame it like that, it's very hard not to be siphoned into that worldview. Who doesn't want better food production, more of it, more efficient agriculture industry? In fact, just ask yourself, if you're wondering, do any of you think when you say to somebody, well, that was really inefficient, that you're complimenting them? The language always tells us what we really value. We value efficiencies. But efficiencies also maximize catastrophe. These kinds of farm systems, and this is what, maybe you're tired of looking at my beautiful cows? Okay. These kinds of farming systems are not resilient. Those intensive operations are not resilient. They are not adaptable, and they are for sure not diverse. So short-term profitability here is at the cost of long-term resilience. I won't talk to you anymore about what's actually happening to the food system because you've had other speakers who have spoken of that. But I want us to consider that we need to have a radically alternative view of the land. If we see the land only as productive, or in this case, an investment opportunity, then we are shortchanging the land. It's a one-dimensional view of land. And its usefulness then becomes diverted entirely to our purposes. We think of it only as, what can it do? And in the investor community, that's really a question of what kind of a return can I get, or even more often, and I suspect that a lot of this is speculative money, maybe not these two, but elsewhere in the investment, it's speculative money. How quickly and at what point will I cleverly flip it and make $1 on it? And having been through some other investment challenges around the high-tech bubble and the housing bubble, land looks like, at this moment, a pretty good investment, a pretty stable, good return investment. So that's one way of viewing land. Another way of viewing land, and this is happening a lot in the international sector where there's a lot of land grab going on, and some of it, quite a bit of it is state facilitated land grabbing. It's during the 2008 spike in food prices and the shortage of food in some places, states were alarmed at the possibility of food insecurity. And those who had wealth, the oil states, for example, have moved into all kinds of areas of the world where land is, as in Saskatchewan, a good value apparently, and have bought vast tracts of land. I urge you to go, if you're looking for data on land grabbing elsewhere in the world, go to a site called grain.org. They keep their eye on this international land grabbing. And much of that land, just for those of you who think, well, efficient food production is actually what the world needs because we need more food because there are more and more hungry people, much of that land in the land grab is actually being diverted to the production of feedstuffs for ethanol production. So these kinds of uses, this way of seeing land, if you see it only as maximizing production or a return on investment, I think it's such a thin view of what land is, such a disconnected view, that it is on many fronts, and I've named a few of them, a very dangerous view. And it endangers not only the people who live there, which it definitely does, but it endangers all of us who in one way or another are reliant on land. And that's all of us. So I want to talk a little bit about a radical revision of that view of land. And thinking about land and our relationship to it in a more complex, deeper way. Moving away from land just being a commodity. Actually, maybe moving away altogether from the view of land being a commodity. Maybe that's an inappropriate way of thinking about land altogether. I just offer you that possibility. Are we going to think about land as a commodity, an investment opportunity, a productive asset to produce only that which we need? Or can we begin to think about land as a living system and a key part of a web of life of which we are part too, from which we draw our sustenance, and where we are to home, and of which we are a part in the long run, literally a part, but now in this life, we are a part of it. Can we think about land like that? I'm going to offer you something that is really dated and yet so fresh when you think about in this new context of land grabbing. A writer and philosopher, I would say, who wrote in the middle of the last century. Aldo Leopold. He was a U.S. Forest Service employee and then eventually a University of Wisconsin professor, wildlife management professor, who had been through and watched the Dust Bowl in Wisconsin, where they had much the experience that we had in the Canadian prairies. And he urged people to rethink, in the face of that, to rethink what it is to have a land ethic, to be an ethical participant in this cycle of life and to treat land like that. And his proposition was that land is a living system and that there's a community. Land is a community of which we are a part. And he gives the example. He says, if you don't think that land is part of our ethical community, then just think about a time when certain human beings were not part of the ethical community, were used as property, slaves. And if you haven't seen 12 Years a Slave, that's a good reminder of what that's like for people when they are treated as property, as a commodity, rather than as part of the ethical community. He urges us to extend our view of what the ethical community encompasses by extending it to the living systems, the land in which we live. and to move us away from this view of land as a commodity, as a property, and into a place where we take human responsibility for land. We are responsible not just for the land, but to the land. It's not just our property. And then it's not our right to use it simply for our purposes, as if it were our property. Then we can't allow our own interest to trump everything else and everybody else who is part of that living system. This view of land extends rights or values to other components, not just us human beings, and certainly not just our dollars. It extends it to other parts of that and makes us part of a community of land. This is such a big stretch for us, given how far down the road of commodification we have gone. But I want to urge us to stretch our imaginations and begin to reconceive what the land is and who we are in the land. And I want to urge us to do this not because it's fun, but because the future depends on it. And if we begin to treat the land again as if not only the future, but our children, our children's children, our grandchildren, their well-being, their fate depends on how the land is cared for, which is why stable farming peasant systems, long-term, have been the most sustainable in the world, because that incentive to take care of it, because you know that the well-being of your children and your grandchildren. This is that moment. This is that segue. I can tell you, I became a grandma 10 days ago. So, on the grandchildren piece, I now know whereof I speak. In any event, if we start to treat the land in such a way that it is we in fact know it nurtures us, and the land, we take responsibility and are responsible to it, then we have, I think, a much better sense, a much more humble, but a much better sense of what our place is in this ecosystem. And unless we achieve that more sustainable, humble, caring, ethical view of ourselves on the land, and what the land gives us and what we give the land, we are in fact in danger of destroying the land on which we depend. But I guess I'm very hopeful that we will, in the end, in the near future, begin to reconceive what the land is and recognize that insofar as we are sacred beings, so the land is sacred. And insofar as the land is a commodity, so we make ourselves and each other commodities, and we break the relationships which are in fact the life-giving web of life. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Wiebe. If I could invite Dr. Van der Zag and Kenton Loby to come up. And that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Just as Kenton and Ray are kind of getting seated, I'm just going to mention something I didn't mention at the beginning, and that is that this event is co-sponsored by CACID, which is the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development. So we'd like to thank CACID